Many of the lochs of Scotland's southwest are hidden away in the rolling hills and forests of the ancient lands of Carrick and Wigtonshire. Remote and often overlooked, these shining jewels in the landscape have played a surprising role in Scottish history. Scotland's lochs are a product of an element we have in spectacular abundance: water. With so much of the stuff about, it's hardly surprising that there are tens of thousands of lochs in Scotland, and they come in all shapes and sizes. We've got long fjord-like sea lochs, great freshwater lochs of the Central Highlands, and innumerable lochans that stud the open moors. In this series, I'm setting out on a loch-hopping journey across Scotland, meeting the people who live close to their shores and discovering how lochs have influenced an entire nation. For this grand tour, I'm heading from a sea loch famous for farewells to the highest point in the south of Scotland, following the trail of Scotland's national hero. My journey starts at Loch Ryan, explores the coast before heading inland to thread a watery way from loch to loch, following Robert the Bruce to the hidden lochs of Galloway. This is Loch Ryan. It was here in the spring of 1307 that forces loyal to the exiled Robert the Bruce landed from Ireland to join the King without a kingdom on his campaign to secure Scottish independence. Robert the Bruce landed successfully a few miles north of here, but not so his brothers Thomas and Alexander. And when they sailed into Loch Ryan with a force of 18 war galleys, they were met by an army loyal to the English. And in the carnage that ensued, they were captured, imprisoned, and then executed at Carlisle Castle. Meanwhile, their brother Robert soldiered on, heading east through country he'd known since childhood. The Bruce launched his invasion of Scotland's southwest from Ireland. Today, the Irish connection continues with frequent daily ferry crossings from the port of Kenryan to Larne on the coast of Ulster. But in all its long history, Loch Ryan was never so busy as it was during the Second World War. Huge structures sprung up on and around the loch. Multitudes of boats and submarines and seaplanes were moored, and thousands of military personnel poured in from around the world. War is a serious business, but for a group of young boys growing up on the banks of the loch, all this activity and all these huge machines spelled excitement and adventure. Down at the old jetty where the flying boats were once hauled ashore, I meet up with one of those boys. Born in 1932, Donnie Nelson has bittersweet memories of those long war years, the RAF and their flying boats. Do you know how many flying boats were here?
I should imagine there'd be anything between about 20 and 50.
Oh really? As many as that?
Oh, aye.
What was it like as a boy growing up here with all this activity around you? It must have been quite exciting, I imagine.
It was very exciting. The air crews were very good at saying, you get out here and we'll take you flying.
That must have been absolutely brilliant.
It was great. I can remember on different occasions flying south on a training flight as far as the Isle of Man and then cutting in towards the north of England over Carlisle and then following the railway line back to Stranraer.
Really?
Right, yes.
During the war, flying boats were deemed essential, and one British model in particular, the Sunderland, became the bane of the German U-boat fleet. This long-range bomber featured machine gun turrets, bombs, aerial mines and depth charges. With such a dangerous array of guns protruding from it, the Germans nicknamed it the Flying Porcupine, and Donnie remembers it well.
I can remember being in a Sunderland and there was 60 or 70 boys in it. clambering all over the place, and everybody having a go in the second pilot seat.
Is everyone having a shot at flying it?
Everybody. You'd be sick with aircraft tossing all over the place.
It must be like a dream come true for a small boy.
It was great fun.
But despite the thrill of these amazing machines, Loch Ryan remained a dangerous place even after the war, as Donny and his friend Paddy Breslin found out to their peril. We've come high on the hills above the loch to visit a strangely out-of-place concrete wall standing over 70 feet high. During the war, pilots were guided by concrete arrows set in the ground towards the wall, which was a practice target. This could be the most bombed structure in Scotland.
Now, Donny, this huge wall behind us has got quite a fascinating and significant history.
Yeah. RAF used it. There is a record that 617 Squadron at one time actually practiced their bombing.
Is it the dam busters?
The dam busters,
Wow.
yes. And it was used extensively. Quite often, if you were in Stranraer, you could hear bombs exploding up here.
Not long after the bombers stopped using the wall for target practice, a truly tragic episode happened here. Donny, Paddy and their gang were throwing around what they thought were spent bombs. It's an episode that has never left Donny.
One of the boys picked up one of these burnt-out husks with incendiary bombs. There was 600 odd of them lying there in a pile ready to be taken away. And he tried flinging it over the wall and it bounced back. So we all had a go. We picked up one each and one of them bounced back and burst into flames. It turned out there was over 600 of them lying there, as I said, and one live one in among them. And when it burst into an intense white flame, we panicked. Paddy stepped in front of me and it exploded. And the next thing, I picked myself up a few yards away. My head was absolutely ringing with the sound of the explosion. And then I heard Paddy shouting and I turned round and he was lying there. Both legs were broken, bits and pieces. And they took Paddy to hospital, but he died that night.
It's terrible. And this is after the war?
This was after the war.
So in a sense he was a casualty of war after cessation of hostilities?
After it.
So that stands as a memorial,
It does.
that wall, doesn't it, to Paddy?
Paddy.
Right, Donny, I've got your wreath.
In memory of young Paddy, Donny lays a wreath up against the wall of the forbidding bomb target, a place where he truly left his childhood behind.
For Paddy Breslin, a great pal.
I head next for Stranraer, principal town in the area, lying at the head of Loch Ryan. The first port was developed here in the mid-18th century, a time of almost constant naval warfare, but also a time of discovery and adventure.
One traveller who left Loch Ryan sailed into the frozen unknown of the high Arctic and lived to tell the tale.
His name was John Ross. With sea salt flowing through his veins, he joined the Navy at the tender age of 9 and sailed all over the world. The great goal of his life was to be the first to discover the fabled Northwest Passage, the elusive northern route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Arctic exploration defined his life and his legacy.
Hello, Paul. Nice to meet you.
Museum curator Jamie Enstone tells me more about this remarkable man's life in the high Arctic.
They would have set out from here on an expedition,
Yeah.
and no one would have any idea when they were going to get back.
I think they expected sort of a couple of years or whatever, but of course until you get there you don't know what you're going to find. So it was difficult to know how long they were going to be away. And I think it was very limited windows of when they could even try. I mean, certainly over winter you would have stood no chance. It would have just been landlocked in ice.
Almost every year, eager explorers would set off looking for a route through the maze of ice and islands off Canada's north coast. John Ross's second expedition is perhaps his most famous because he went missing for 4.5 years. Icebound, the crew only managed to move 7 miles between their first and third winters. John Ross eventually returned and published an illustrated account of his adventures. But how did he and the crew survive such hardship?
So he kept the crew together for 4 years?
They had a camp and they went out from camp on various expeditions. He was very good to his crew, actually, and they did even make up classrooms. Not many of his crew could read, so he was teaching them to read and write.
How on earth did they survive?
He was a very adaptable character, and they actually befriended the Inuits because they took on the diet. The Inuits, they ate seal, blubber and things like that, which contains high vitamin C.
So they used local knowledge from the local people in order to survive that time.
In his own words, John Ross reported that the crew were reduced to the last stage of debility by want of provisions. So I'm astonished to find this tin of beef in the museum collection, which went with him. It wasn't opened until 40 years after his Arctic ordeal, when he finally gifted it to local aristocrat, the Earl of Stair. In the face of actual starvation, Ross would not open it. But why?
Tinned beef?
Yes.
What was wrong with it?
I don't know, but clearly it wasn't very appetising. And he eventually presented it to Lord Stair on his birthday as a birthday gift.
It was opened and it was tasted and it was found to be quite good.
Quite good.
I'm hoping they survived.
Yes, they did. They did live to tell the tale. They did indeed.
Well, braver men than me.
Yeah.
The significance of the tin of beef must remain a mystery, but it was at least 57 years old by the time the young Earl of Stair dined on it. John Ross must have had a truly iron will. He continued looking for the Northwest Passage into his 70s and then retired to Stranraer. It wasn't until the 20th century that a route through the Northwest Passage was finally achieved. Just to the east of Stranraer are 3 lochs: the White Loch, the Black Loch and Soulseat Loch.
When John Ross was a wee boy, his father was the minister of the now ruined kirk overlooking the White Loch here. Now at that time, the God-fearing Earl of Stair would row his boat every Sunday to attend services, and the two became firm friends.
The Earls of Stair play a huge part in both Scottish and British history, although it's the second Earl I'm interested in because he had the ambition and foresight to lay out these unique gardens. He was also one of the most famous military men of his generation, commanding forces at most of the major European battles of his time. He became a field marshal and commander-in-chief of the whole British Army. Making my way to the ruins of Castle Kennedy, the Earl's first home, which still forms the centrepiece of his famous gardens, I meet head gardener John MacArthur of that ilk. This is the correct way to address a clan chief, because John is also the chief of Clan MacArthur. Now that's a real feather in his cap.
Now, he was a great military man, the second Earl. Did he use his military background in any way to landscape the castle gardens?
We believe he did. Some of the embankments look very similar to features in notable battles. We have one area called the gun emplacements, where you can imagine there would be guns positioned to fight battles.
But how did he actually physically go about landscaping such a huge area?
Well, the story went that he had his own private army, and when they weren't fighting battles, they were used in the construction of the embankments.
Quite a handy workforce. But you don't have an army, do you?
No, we have 3 full-time gardeners and a groundsman.
Right, a very small army.
For 76 acres.
The Earl was also a man of his time. This was an age of reason and progress, and the nobility were keen to show how nature could be tamed within the grounds of their estates. The Earl's status introduced him to the impressively ornate gardens of the English aristocracy. And his travels to France had also planted in him ideas of symmetry and landscaping on a grand scale.
He was no doubt influenced by Versailles, where he was working in France. And if you look at the landscape at Versailles, there's striking similarities to some of the landscapes here at Castle Kennedy Gardens.
So he was bringing over continental ideas to this corner of southwest Scotland back in the 18th century. That was quite a novel thing to do.
Very much so, yes, yes.
Leaving the gardens, I come to the small village of Castle Kennedy, which was built to house workers on the Stair estate. And it's not far from here that I pick up the first traces of a lost route that at one time ran all the way through Galloway and Dumfriesshire.
Now this private house behind me was once upon a time Castle Kennedy's very own railway station, and from there you could have bought tickets to Dumfries and beyond. But sadly, no longer.
The Port Patrick to Dumfries Railway, which opened in stages from 1861, connected towns such as Glenluce, Newton Stewart, Creetown and Castle Douglas to Dumfries and the rest of the rail network. But the old line became a victim of the controversial cuts implemented on the advice of Dr. Beeching in the 1960s.
When Dr. Beeching's axe fell, all the communities along a great stretch of the Solway coast were suddenly cut off from the rail network, and with the loss of the trains, an entire way of life disappeared.
There are clues to the old line all over Galloway. Stations, sidings, embankments, and in many places just lovely pathways to follow if you're determined enough and don't mind straying off the beaten track. I found a stretch of the old line a few miles east of Castle Kennedy.
Now clearly I can't get any further along this stretch of the old railway line because there's a barrier here to stop anyone crossing over the old viaduct which spans the water of Luce. Now it's hard to imagine today with all this jungle around what a busy line this was in its heyday with passenger trains and goods trains rattling through the countryside. But fortunately we do have an accurate record of those times, a film made by a self-confessed steam enthusiast. It's absolutely brilliant.
Local hotelier Dan McLachlan shot this film on a summer's day in 1965, just days before the line closed forever. A eulogy to the age of steam in Galloway, when the pace was slower, allowing soot-stained firemen to tend their boilers, post packages to be exchanged, or simply to allow the trains to gather steam to tackle the Galloway hills. The sympathies of filmmaker Dan McLachlan are very clear. He loved steam trains, and he loved this line, and I, for one, am grateful for his lovely film. The old line ran inland through the Galloway Hills, offering connections to the tiny settlements around Loch Ken, which is my next destination. Folklore, fables and fishermen's tales grace many of Scotland's lochs. Ask any tourist and they'll tell you the Loch Ness Monster is the most internationally known thing about Scotland. But some lochs harbour real monsters. I've joined Robin Aid to learn more about Loch Ken and the huge predatory pikes for which it's famous, and one particular 18th century pike for which it's infamous.
Loch Ken is famous for its pikes,
It certainly is, yes, because of the 72-pounder, the Kenmure pike.
I mean, that's the size of a small shark.
It's huge. It can eat a 10-pound salmon easily.
Good grief. Who caught the Kenmure pike?
John Murray, the gamekeeper for the Kenmure estate, caught it. And the laird had been complaining that he wasn't getting very many fish on his table. Right. So John went out and came back with this fish and asked if that was big enough for him.
It must have been a huge fish.
Absolute monster of a thing. Yes, crocodile type thing.
Do you know how long it was?
60 odd inches.
Good grief. That's over 5 foot.
Yes, about it's 5 foot long. Yeah.
Man-sized pike.
A man-sized pike. No, a man's head would fit in the mouth of a fish like that easily.
Really?
Yes, because it will even with a big good 30-pounder.
That's a frightening thought, if you were to ever fall in. You're saying there are lots of pike here, and a pike is a voracious and ruthless predator. So there must be an awful lot of for it to predate on.
Oh, a hell of a lot of things. All the other fish species, plus the ducks. They take ducks freely. Oh, yes.
Do they?
Especially the baby one.
Oh, dear. So these ducklings are a delicacy.
Yes, indeed.
Robin's claim that they eat duck is well founded. In fact, there's a story that John Murray noticed ducklings just disappearing from the surface of the loch, and the quick-thinking gilly used one to bait the monster. A bit of digging has turned up a literary reference and an image of its skull, sent to a gentleman's magazine in 1798 by none other than John Murray's boss, Captain John Gordon, who writes, "It was the largest pike perhaps ever taken in Great Britain." And let me tell you, 72 pounds would make it the largest freshwater fish ever taken in Great Britain. But he also sensationally claims that there are no less than 22 rows of teeth in the creature's jaw, and you can clearly see them in his drawing. Now, is fact and fable intertwining down here on the banks of Loch Ken? Robin and I go for a pint at the Kenbridge Hotel. Painstaking research and good draftsmanship have allowed Robin to produce a life-size image of John Murray's historic pike, allowing us to further investigate the jaw of the species.
It's enormous, isn't it?
It's a colossal thing. They're more of an alligator or a crocodile than they are of a fish, these things.
He shows me the skull of a pike, 1/3 of its size, and I can confirm that the rows of teeth do indeed look vicious and deadly. So I'm somewhat relieved that, as usual, I went fishing and caught nothing. I'm intrigued by the story of the monster pike and John Murray the gamekeeper. Apparently, Murray was held in great affection by his employers, who paid for a headstone when he died in 1777. He's buried in a kirkyard not far from the head of the loch.
Now here it is, John Murray's gravestone, the man who landed the monster pike of Loch Ken. And it's an interesting example of the stonemason's craft. And John's profession is symbolised here with the gun, his folded fishing rod, a powder cask, a partridge or a pheasant down there, and his faithful hound dog, of course, and an inscription by his employer in memory of John Murray. But intriguingly, around the back of the gravestone is a poem, apparently composed by a local minister. It's very weathered and almost illegible, but I can read, "Ah, John, what changes since I saw thee last? Thy fishing and thy shooting days are past. Bagpipes and hautboys thou canst sound no more. Thy nods, grimaces, winks and pranks are o'er." Now it sounds to me as if John Murray was quite a character. Perhaps the sort of man to tell fishermen's tales.
For the last part of my grand tour, I'm returning westwards, following a section of the Southern Upland Way, the 212-mile coast-to-coast, long-distance path that crosses southern Scotland, taking me to the lochs of the Great Galloway Forest and into the heart of Bruce country.
Robert the Bruce knew this country like the back of his hand, and he developed new tactics here. Using local knowledge and the lie of the land, he fought a guerrilla war against the English. And after he defeated an enemy force near Clattering Shores, he headed for the hills, where he set a trap for King Edward's men.
In the hills above Loch Truel, the glen enters a narrow defile known as the Steps of Truel. And it was here, on the steep, craggy slopes, that Bruce's small army waited with hope and fear. Would they pull it off?
According to the epic poem The Bruce, written by John Barber in the 1370s, Bruce's enemies were forced by the narrowness of the path through the woods to move in single file, and this made them fatally vulnerable.
The poem describes what happened when Bruce saw his advantage. At once the noble king took the banner from his standard bearer and cried, "Upon them, for they are vanquished all!" Bruce's foes were routed, and although the action was more of a skirmish than a battle, it was an important morale-boosting episode and turned the tide for Bruce, paving the way for ultimate victory at Bannockburn 7 years later.
Many accounts of the battle emphasise Bruce's tactic of rolling boulders down on the heads of his enemies. Now, I have to admit that until I came here, I was just a wee bit sceptical about this story, until I saw some of the boulders for myself. They're lying on the hillside and in amongst the trees here. So perhaps, after all, they could have been used as ammunition to help defeat the English.
Bruce's victory is commemorated today with a massive boulder, exactly the sort you'd imagine crushing his enemies. Erected in 1929 to mark the 600th anniversary of Bruce's death, the stone honours the symbolic father of the nation.
Now, the Bruce Stone also marks the starting point for a trek up the highest hill in the Borders, the mighty Merrick, which is where I'm heading next.
At 2,766 feet, Merrick doesn't boast Munro status, but rises higher than any point in Scotland south of Ben Lomond. And to the south, there isn't anything higher until you get to the Lake District in England. The Ordnance Survey map for this area is an entertainment in itself, purely because of the curious names of the hills, glens and ridges. I could traverse the Rig of Gloon, cross over the Neve of Spit, climb the Shallach of Minnoch and descend the Rig of Jarkness. What they might mean, I have no idea, but I like the sound of them.
Now here we are at last, the summit of the mighty Merrick, and the trig point marking the highest point in the whole of Galloway. In fact, there's no one higher than I am for hundreds of square miles. And as you'd expect, the view from here is absolutely superb. So away to the southeast on the horizon, I could just make out the hills of the Lake District. And away to the west over there, through the mist, you can actually see Ailsa Craig. Of course, in front of me, you've got the rolling green countryside leading all the way to Loch Ryan, and the start of my grand tour of the Galloway Lochs. Superb.
Following whisky and shoals of herring, my next grand tour takes me from Campbelltown to Loch Fyne.
Winter Watch is back to add a little bit of seasonal warmth. God knows we need it. Tuesday at 8 here on BBC Two. Next we enter the Victorian House of Arts and Crafts, and this week our crafters are tackling the dining room. Wonder what challenges that'll throw up.